Hello there. My name is Sydney Lai, and I'm on stage today because I've lived a very rebellious life. I don't like to listen to my mom. Who else doesn't like to listen to their mom? Yeah? All right. But you know that your mother is always right. And this is something that I've learned about innovating ecosystems. So what I want to share today is something that I'm very passionate about and has given purpose in my life. You see, what I'm most interested in is how innovation changes communities. When I think of innovation, I think of the advancement of technology, startups, and apps. But then I realize to create innovation, I myself must define what innovation means. So in my book, innovation is a solution, and community, well, community is an area or an identity that you align with. And so I've dedicated my career to working in emerging technology, creating startup ecosystems, but then many people ask, well, how did I get involved? You see, it started when I was quite young. My parents are business owners. They're very entrepreneurial. They're resilient. I'm not resilient. I'm a millennial. When my app crashes, it's the end of the world, right? Exactly. So when they first moved to Red Bluff, California, it's a small town of 13,000 people, and one thing I realized was from them, when we look at how to innovate ecosystems, we need to stop emulating Silicon Valley because it distracts your community from innovating its unique ecosystem. And when I started getting engaged in businesses, when they moved here from Taiwan, I realized they didn't know the right people, they didn't have the right resources, the right credentials. So they bussed tables, washed dishes, and they were able to gather some funding, and they opened a restaurant. They shared a part of their own selves, their own community, with the community around them. And what happened then was they started working with the elementary schools, they helped volunteering and doing fundraisers, and they opened a business. They shared a part of their own community. And then like that, their community expanded. They moved to Redding as well, and they opened another restaurant. With that being created, I remember after school spending these long hours helping them at the restaurants. And something that I learned was that innovation actually requires one of your greatest assets, and that is your time. But for me, there was something much more important than my sense of time. And it was my sense of purpose, my sense of identity, my sense that the world around me was progressing in a way where I woke up tomorrow knowing the time that I spent was worth it. And after these long hours, I realized that I felt a sense of loneliness, that there was no one around that I could identify with. So I picked up and I moved. I moved to Silicon Valley. I went to college there. And for 4 years, I studied something very specific, and it was the sociology of entrepreneurship. I saw how innovation was created not just nationally, but globally as well. And after 4 years, I have my degree in hand, and I said, I did it. I did college. I understand how the world works. And I understand Silicon Valley. Hungry, I left. I first went to Taiwan, where I worked in research and development on semiconductors. I remember soldering these Wi-Fi chips into the mobile phones. I then moved to Washington, D.C., where I worked at the U.S. Department of Commerce. And there, I helped write grants and approve grants to help these small businesses across the nation get funding for their small companies. I then moved to Germany. I then moved to Germany, and there I did business partnerships for German tech companies and Chinese tech companies. Then to San Francisco and New York City, where then I worked in finance to help these individuals raise capital and gain assets to build their wealth and businesses. But it wasn't until I got back in Silicon Valley and I started engaging with the community that I then realized there was something completely different. And so what I want to share right now is a series of stories of different individuals that have touched my life, but also made innovation in their own community. Here's Andrew Hyde, and he started a global movement. Andrew Hyde is also from a humble beginning. He's from a small town of 2,000 people, Sisters, Oregon, and he created this event where in a weekend you can create a business. This startup event caught on, and you could see this across the US, across the nation, and then Startup Weekend was created. And Startup Weekend is now a global movement where we represent innovation in our own communities, different races, different genders, different skill sets and talents. And now we are across 150 nations with 3,500 volunteers. You can see this in Nairobi, in Cuba, and last year, for the first time, we brought this to Redding, California. And what we saw there was that there was an engagement of communities from all over. We had people who not only who could code, who could design, but we had a restaurant cook, a dermatologist. And then I reflected on how I first experienced my startup ecosystem. And this is Thibaut. Thibaut and I, we were classmates, and we went to a startup event. And there he came with one idea. You see, his sister is deaf. And so is their mother. And so is their father. In fact, he is the only one in his family who can verbally speak. So he came with a single idea, and he wanted to provide a solution for his sister. His sister had these ambitions to become a lawyer, but they were kind of dwindled due to the resources out there. And so up on stage, a weekend has passed, and he brought up this humble prototype. It was a glove with wires pouring out of it. And you could hear the audience just dead silent, cautiously breathing. And with the glove hand raised, in a robotic voice, it announced, "I cannot speak." Moved, I felt myself pushing back tears. I turned to the stranger next to me, and she showed me the goosebumps on her arm. And I thought, like that, the audience cheered with a thundering applause. And a year had passed. They raised venture capital. They went through an accelerator program. They found mentors. I thought this was the solution. This was the need for all these communities that were ignored by the media about Silicon Valley. This is what we needed. And so when I looked into how to revitalize these economies, these communities, I thought the answer was to find the next Silicon Valley. So then I was on this campaign. I wanted to save the world, right? And what I started doing first, I went back to Silicon Valley. I worked in a venture capital firm. I ran an accelerator program in San Francisco, helping batches of startups. And I thought, this is exactly what we need, right? But it wasn't until I actually went to a small city and applied these that I learned something completely different. So this is Krista Jackson. And Krista Jackson is a community leader in Reno, Nevada. And Reno, Nevada is also a fairly small city. You see, she was raised there. She went to college there. Well, in college, she studied French literature in Reno. And what we then realized was that, like many small cities across this nation, small cities typically rely on one very specific industry. And well, in Reno, they relied heavily on the gaming industry. So unless if you were a French interpreter in a casino, there were not too many opportunities, so she moved away. And when we look at Reno, it's an industry that relied on gaming, but for many generations. And yes, they're innovating, and they found a few new ideas, but it was still a place where you had to create your own career path and your own opportunity. So the financial crisis hit, the housing market crashed, people were laid off, and jobs were gone, and she moved back. And what we saw then was Midtown Reno starting to flourish with different businesses, a diversity of businesses. And when she moved back, she became a chocolatier. She had her own company. And this, for me, from the Bay Area, this was incredible. You mean, you can be a chocolatier? You can have these different forms of small businesses? I remember even meeting someone who was a brewer, and he had his own brewing company, and he could afford to live and work in his own community. Because if you look like this in Silicon Valley, you're probably a programmer, and you write JavaScript for a living, right? And so I thought, okay, this was the answer to help revitalize and innovate small communities and ecosystems. It was through small businesses. So I moved back to Redding, and I said, okay, Mom, I'd like to help revitalize these small cities and towns. What can I do? How do I help the small businesses? Well, she said, well, I have a restaurant, and we don't have an online presence. Why don't you make a website for us? And of course, I thought, I'm from Silicon Valley, I can do this. This is incredible, this is my opportunity, because at this point, I'm working at an aerospace startup. I design and distribute mission operation software for satellites. I work in virtual reality, and I help these different virtual reality startups create users and generate revenue. And I thought, OK, I can design a website. I can do this. And then I start getting to it, and what I realized was, rather than trying to make a website to showcase a restaurant selling Mongolian barbecue, what I designed was like an Apple product with a bowl of noodles attached to it, right? It was not right, and my mom's like, okay, well, really, why don't you just create a delivery option? We just expanded our business model, and we now have sushi. Can you just do something just to create an ability to deliver sushi? And I said, I got this. I got this. I understand on demand. Here's an opportunity to innovate Redding. But all she really wanted was a phone number on her website. You see where this tragedy is going. And I said, no, no, no. This app will revolutionize Redding. I'm going to create this on-demand service, and with a push of a button, you can get bike delivery and get sushi at your doorstep. I proudly handed these to my mother, and she was like, oh, no. And what she told me then really helped me solidify, understand how innovating communities work. She told me, Silicon Valley does a really good job at creating startup, having venture capital, having angels, but we must take and learn what works there and adapt to what works in our own small communities and cities. I then realized that, oh my God, my mom understands product market fit. Yeah, more than Steve Jobs, right? She was the Steve Jobs of Redding. And so I started to reflect how innovation was developed across the nation in these small towns, and I looked back at Redding, California. And what I remember then was Redding does a really good job at what we do. The first thing I remembered was we began with these wonderful small business festivals, and you had local businesses and restaurants and cafes, musicians and crafters. They came out, and they shared with one another their products, their projects. And then what happened next was we really utilized our affordability of space and housing. So we have the Shasta Economic Development Corporation, and they created this massive co-working space. And with this co-working space, we had startups and small businesses and freelancers and programmers, and they got together, they shared the space, and they shared ideas with one another. They shared their businesses. And if you look at this is incredible, but when you think of New York City, the co-working spaces there, they build up, they're siloed into different levels. And what I saw then was this opportunity to even utilize the other spaces around us. Then we now have One Shop, and One Shop is also in Redding, California. They utilize a huge warehouse where they have a makerspace, and they gather the community members, the students, to create electronics, IoT, and make projects with one another. What we then saw was the schools in Redding. They began to engage with our community. The students from high school and colleges worked on science and technology. So there's 3 things I want to remind you on how to innovate a community. And I've seen this work in Silicon Valley, in Berlin, in Stockholm, in Chattanooga, Tennessee, and Redding, California. And number 1, we must all gather. Everyone is gathering, and it works. Take time out of work and go to a tech meetup, go to a festival, go to a conference, come to TEDx, right? And number 2, share. Share your story, your ideas, your time, your mentorship, your guidance. And number 3, do. Take the initiative. Do whatever you are interested in, but we must do what works for our community rather than copying and pasting what's happening in other technology hubs. So one thing I want to remind you today is being the next Silicon Valley is not the way to innovation. Thank you.